Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. We are honoured to have as our guest today Professor Stuart Russell. Stuart is Professor of Computer Science at the University of California, Berkeley, and the traditional way to introduce him is to say that he literally wrote the book on AI. Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, which he co-wrote with Peter Norvig, was first published in 1995 and the fourth edition came out in 2020. Stuart has been urging us all to take seriously the dramatic implications of advanced AI for longer than perhaps any other prominent AI researcher. He also proposes practical solutions, as in his 2019 book, Human Compatible: Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. In 2021, Stuart gave the Reith Lectures and was awarded an OBE. But the greatest of his many accolades was surely in 2014, when a character with a background remarkably like his was played in the movie Transcendence by Johnny Depp. Stuart, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you, Callum. Nice to be with you, and David too.
Stuart, thanks so much for joining us.
Stuart, this March, you and Max Tegmark and a few thousand of your closest friends called for a moratorium on the development of the most advanced AI systems. There hasn't been a moratorium, obviously, but you certainly sparked a lively debate. How do you think that debate's progressed?
The moratorium asked for pause in the development and release of systems more powerful than GPT-4, which had been released about a week before that. And in fact, no systems more powerful than GPT-4 were released during the 6-month period that followed the open letter. So in a sense, there was a pause. The only system that I know of that's rival GPT-4 is Gemini, which Google DeepMind announced a few days ago. And I would say the pundits are in two minds about whether it's actually more powerful than GPT-4. It's a multimodal model, incorporates image and video data as well as text. But a lot of people are saying it's not that impressive. It's really Google trying to catch up and maybe not succeeding. We will see. I think the bigger point is that it wasn't expected that people would take it literally, but we wanted people to think about why we were asking. And the reason we were asking is quite explicit in the open letter. It's that we don't know how to control, how to regulate this technology. And it was moving quicker than governments could figure out what to do about it. And it presented a number of obvious and immediate risks, not just the longer-term risk that this was a stepping stone on the way to systems more capable than human beings, but that systems like GPT-4 themselves presented immediate risks, such as the generation of disinformation, advising bioterrorists, that kind of thing. So it had, I would say, a pretty immediate impact. The next day, UNESCO cited the open letter and called on all of their member states, which is now every country on Earth, to implement the UNESCO recommendation on AI in the form of legislation. There were emergency meetings held in the White House. There were resignations such as Jeff Hinton, who resigned from Google in order to be able to talk about the risks to the human race from systems that he foresaw coming down the pipe. So I think it had an impact. In fact, when I started giving talks on this about 10 years ago, I had in my talks a sort of fictitious email exchange where a superior alien civilization sends an email to the human race, actually to humanity@un.org, warning that their spaceships will arrive on Earth in 30 to 50 years' time. And humanity@un.org replies with an out-of-office auto-reply. Humanity's currently out of the office. We'll respond to your email when we return. And I think basically what happened after the open letter was humanity returned to the office and saw the email from the aliens. And what's been happening since then is pretty similar to what would happen if we did receive an email from an alien civilization.
Up to a point, the letter definitely generated a huge amount of debate. And no doubt this year, people have been talking about superintelligence in a way that they haven't really, certainly not since 2015 and probably not at all. But there's an odd paradox. My impression is if you talk to most people and say humanity's in the process of developing machines which will eventually lead to superintelligence, and superintelligence might wipe us out. Might well not, but might do. Almost everybody who hasn't thought about it before says, why on earth are you doing that? Stop immediately, please. And when I give talks and I say to people, I've got this big red button. If I press this big red button, you might all live forever and live lives of happiness and joy, or we might all get wiped out. And I can't really tell you what the odds are between the two. Hands up those who want me to press the big red button. About 2 or 3 people put their hands up and the rest go, no, please don't do that. That's a common sense response. And yet, there isn't a great upswell of demand that politicians get this moratorium to happen. And I find that quite odd. It's as if people are starting to wake up and they don't like the idea, but they're not taking action. They're not demanding anything. Do you think that's just a delayed response and it will come?
I think it will absolutely come. It might require a sort of Chernobyl-sized catastrophe. As long as that first catastrophe isn't total, I think you're right. Although it would be nice to have all these shiny new things, people, at least in the advanced economies, people feel like, yeah, I don't need to have a giant gin palace yacht and 20 cars and all the other shiny things that I could have. But I certainly want to be alive, and I want my kids to be alive. And actually, I want my kids to have careers and not to be idle players of video games for the rest of their lives. So a lot of people not only want to avoid the risks, they're not even sure whether it will be a good idea, even if it works. Even if it is completely safe and completely controlled, do we actually want to live in that world? And I think that's a good question. Another interesting phenomenon is that in the US, at least, and I think to some extent now in Britain, this is a bipartisan issue. I've been in the Senate in the US now twice to talk about this. And you couldn't tell, if you just looked at transcripts of the senators speaking, you wouldn't be able to tell which party they belonged to. And in fact, in many ways, the Republicans sounded more left-wing than the Democrats on this topic. And I think the political view is, if you put your finger in the wind and see which way the wind is blowing, are you going to be on the side of humanity or on the side of our AI overlords? It's not a difficult decision for a politician to make. The places where there's a problem, for example, I'm here in France. France made a concerted effort to eviscerate the European AI Act for, I would say, fairly blatant commercial reasons. They had a couple of successful startups and they felt that it was in their national interest to nurture those national champions, and therefore they tried to get rid of all the regulations in the AI Act that applied to foundation models.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
Do you think that the way that it ended up with, as I understand it, the foundation models coming under the regulatory oversight, unless they're open source, do you think that was a sensible outcome?
If they're big enough, then even if they're open source, they'll still be regulated.
Oh, so Mistral is not going to escape the regulatory oversight then?
So Mistral actually is not that big.
Yeah, but presumably when it gets there, it will grow.
The numbers I think it's the same in the European Act as in President Biden's executive order. There's a threshold. Once you're above that threshold, then you're subject to all kinds of reporting regulations and pre-release testing and so on. I think it's 10 to the 25 or 10 to the 26 operations in the training process. We're not quite there yet. So I think the next one after GPT-4, later next year, I think we're looking at systems that are 10 times bigger, and those will cross the threshold.
Stuart, you said there might be an AI version of Chernobyl, or maybe an AI version of, I don't know, Cambridge Analytica, or the WannaCry ransomware crisis, or Om Shinrikyo. What do you think actually might happen? And if such a thing were to happen, and presidents and prime ministers called you up and said, help us out here, what advice would you give?
It would depend very much on the nature of the crisis. I would argue that, in fact, we've already seen a Chernobyl, but it was a slow-moving Chernobyl in the form of social media recommender systems. So the algorithms that decide what literally billions of people read and watch every day, those algorithms, they have more control over human cognitive intake than any dictator in history has ever had. Yet they're subject to no democratic oversight whatsoever. And because they're designed to optimize some metric like the number of clicks or the amount of time that you're watching videos, they have learned to manipulate people in order to change people into more predictable consumers of content. So they don't just try to send you the thing you're most likely to click on. They send you the thing that will turn you into someone who is easier to predict in future. So in a sense, they have learned to brainwash people. And anecdotally, at least, and I think many people are seeing this on a fairly large scale, that in order to do that, they try to turn you into a more extreme version of yourself. So if you show an interest in boxing, then pretty soon you'll be watching ultimate fighting and snuff movies and other kinds of violent porn. And if you show an interest in trees, you'll be taken along a spectrum towards eco-terrorism and so on. This creates a kind of fragmentation and polarization of society that has been extremely harmful. And again, anecdotally, many people blame these systems for what's happened in the US, what happened in Chile, what happened in Slovakia, and many other countries where the general tenor of the public sphere has become acrimonious and divided, and people are living in different worlds.
Is that really the fault of AI as opposed to Fox News and Rupert Murdoch and similar old school media?
I certainly wouldn't want to absolve Fox News and Rupert Murdoch of any role in this, but in fact, far more people get their news from social media than watch Fox. It's quite deliberate the way the algorithms are designed. I think the consequences of the algorithms are not necessarily intended by the platforms, but this is an example of AI systems basically optimizing the wrong objective. And then we see the consequences, the sort of side effects, the collateral damage of a system that's pursuing the wrong objective. This is exactly what people have been warning about for many years, that we're going to have, as AI systems become more and more capable, unless we figure out how to get them perfectly aligned with what humans want the future to be like, then they're going to be misaligned. And the more capable they are, the worse the outcome is going to be.
So we've been talking mostly about the risks and the potential downsides of advanced AI. And that's probably what you're best known for, because there hasn't been enough attention to it before. But to avoid making this episode entirely ghastly and depressing, let's just take this opportunity to ask you about how would you imagine a world in which superintelligence has arrived and it went fantastically well?
It's an interesting question. And in fact, I had a plan to basically collect together some economists, some AI researchers, some science fiction writers, and some futurists, and lock them in a room and not let them out until they could answer that question. And just as I was about to execute this plan, COVID happened. So I couldn't lock them in a room. I could only lock them in a Zoom room, which doesn't work very well. And it turned out to be extraordinarily difficult. Over several weeks, we had about 12 hours of Zoom meetings. And it's actually extremely difficult for people to visualize that world. First of all, the most obvious problem is, well, what are the humans doing? Because for obvious economic reasons, if AI systems can do every job that humans can do and basically do it for nothing, then very few humans are going to be employed, at least in the traditional sense. And this is something you see in science fiction. So there are a few science fiction non-dystopias with very advanced AI. I think the most well-known is Ian Banks's culture novels, where they have AI systems that far outdo human beings in every imaginable dimension. And we use those AIs. Somehow they've figured out how to get the AIs to be strictly helpful to humanity. But there's this massive problem. And he can't figure out the answer, which is, what are all the humans doing? And in some sense, it's a little bit like Wall-E. They're kind of on a lifelong cruise. It's not a cruise that goes on for a week. It's a cruise that goes on for 100 years, and you're just on it the whole time. And the only people who can get off the cruise ship, so to speak, are the ones who were in the sort of equivalent of Starfleet. They're a very small fraction whose job it is to go out to the edges of the galaxy and explore new star systems and try to bring in more civilizations into the umbrella of human civilization. So everyone wants to get into this sort of Starfleet, just as they do in Star Trek. And besides that, there isn't a clear purpose to life beyond just sort of enjoying yourself. And I think Wall-E is an accurate depiction. Wall-E, because humans no longer have to run their civilization, they don't. And not only that, they don't know how to run their civilization. They lose the incentive to learn because they don't need to learn. I know you asked me to actually give the rosy scenario.
You're deviating back to your pessimistic view.
Yeah, so why is it so difficult?
Well, let me offer an alternative then. You and I have agreed to disagree on this in the past. I think that a world in which humans don't have to do jobs forever, in which humans are not wage slaves forever, actually could be a very good thing. And I think there are a number of classes of people who show that you really don't need a job to have a meaningful, happy life. One of them is aristocrats. The people who lived the best lives in Europe, certainly, most of the time since the Middle Ages, were aristocrats. And some of them had jobs. They had estates to run. They had countries to run sometimes if they had empires. But most of them just lived lives of leisure. And they had great lives. Everybody else was slaving around, living a subsistence, horrible life. And the aristocrats were the only people having any fun. Another group is comfortably off retired people. And because of the age that we all are, I know quite a lot of these people, they are busy as anything. They're arranging all sorts of events, art shows, theatre gatherings, music events, poker nights, dinners, what have you. And if you say to them, oh, you must be depressed because you haven't got a job to do, they say, go away, I don't want a job. And then the third category is children. Show me a child who thinks they need a job in order to have a meaningful life. The thing is, people will always do work. And I think one of the problems with this area is that people mix up work and jobs. Jobs are things that you do for money in order to put food on the table and perhaps give some structure to your life and, in a small number of cases, give some meaning to your life. It doesn't do that for most people. Work is stuff you do because it uses your talents and exercises your mind. And I think we'll always do that because we're hardwired to do that. But it doesn't seem to me that we need to have jobs in order to do work or to have a meaningful life.
I think we'll agree to disagree again.
Again.
Each of these examples one can push back on. Retired people are people who are retired from a life of work. They've had a purpose, a reason to get out of bed for the last 50 years. They have some sense of completion and achievement. They have kids and grandkids. It's not clear that it would work as well if they had been unemployed for their entire lives. So a counterexample would be, well, there are plenty of people in advanced economies who are unemployed, but they're not destitute. They have what historically would have been a perfectly adequate standard of living. And yet it's psychologically disastrous for many people. Aristocrats, the ones who were completely idle, I don't necessarily say that that would be a lifestyle we would want to emulate. A lot of them were regarded as dissolute, useless, and at least the British aristocrats developed this whole system of boarding schools in order to build character, at least in their male offspring, and later on their female offspring, because they found that without that, they were dissolute right from the word go. They're a very special category. They're the sort of 1/10 of 1% of the population. And don't forget that they sustained their self-respect by believing that they were superior to all other creatures of God's creation. But with superintelligent AI, they wouldn't be superior. They would be inferior, and they would know it.
That is a serious issue that we will face if we do get superintelligence and we survive it and it decides, or they decide to help us flourish. I think we could well get quite depressed by looking at it and thinking, wow, we've just become the chimpanzees in this picture. This thing has now supplanted us as the smartest entity around, and it could be quite disabling for us.
And in fact, Ian Banks does explore this issue a little bit. And I think this is what should happen. If our AI systems are well designed and their concern is the well-being of the human race, then they should interact with us in a way that allows us to preserve our sense of purpose and our self-respect. They should actually hold back, not do everything for us, not metaphorically keep tying our shoelaces for us, and eventually say, no, you got to tie your own shoelaces. And in the extreme case, if there's really no way for us to coexist successfully, then they should disappear.
Which is what happens at the end of the movie, Her. I always think that Ian Banks cheats in a delightful and superbly gracious way. The idea that these ships, which are run by minds, which operate millions of times faster than any human mind and are astonishingly clever, the idea that they could have a conversation with a human being is ridiculous. It would be like trying to converse with an ant that was operating on one thought in a lifetime. It couldn't really be done. But he does it with such grace and charm that it's easy to forgive him. I guess we should probably go back to the risk stuff, which is what you're famous for. Last month, we had the Bletchley Park Global Summit on AI safety, which was a catalyst for global political leaders to talk about existential risk for the first time. And I think it's fair to say there's a consensus that the event was well organized and productive. Do you think it had a significant impact? Do you think it will have a lasting impact?
Yes. That it happened at all is remarkable. It wasn't that long ago. It was about 9 months ago that the British government said there really are no risks from AI. We're not going to have any regulations. We're going full speed ahead, pro-innovation, pro-technology. So that was February. And then in June, they said, okay, AI safety is an extraordinarily important thing, and we're going to convene a global summit to look at these extreme risks. So that's an incredible, I don't want to say U-turn, I want to say evolution in understanding on the part of the government. And then to get 28 other countries lined up, including countries like China, India, Indonesia, et cetera, to bring such a cross-section of countries together and have them all sign a declaration saying, this is an incredibly serious issue and we're going to devote our efforts to making sure that the worst of the risks don't come to pass. I think it's pretty amazing. I was there only on the first day. The second day was basically for just the ministers and I think the CEOs. The first day's discussions were pretty good. For many of the ministers and heads of state, that was the first time they had really heard what the issues are from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Must have been quite shocking for a lot of them.
I think it probably was, yeah.
Good.
The presence of China was probably the biggest win because up until I think maybe 2 days before the summit, it still wasn't clear if they were going to attend at all. And the fact that they attended means that we can actually, I hope, dispense with this, what we call the but China argument. Anyone who talks about safety or regulation, someone will pipe up and say, but China is going to go ahead and do all these things. So what's the point in us not doing them? Which is sort of a ridiculous argument for any form of evil that you're discussing. You say, well, if we don't do this evil thing, well, China's going to do this evil thing. But in fact, China is regulating AI much more strictly than the US or Europe. And they've more or less have a de facto ban on public-facing large language models.
Yeah, they're not keen on creating more minds that might have thoughts that they can't control.
Yeah, they see it as potentially new centers of power that are outside their hands, and that's not what they're interested in.
If the but China argument's been refuted, what about the but Russia, or the but North Korea, or the but drugs mafia arguments?
There are certainly reasons to think twice about open sourcing powerful AI systems. I don't think Russia and North Korea can build high-quality AI systems. Even China wasn't able to build systems that come close to what OpenAI and DeepMind have been able to produce, despite very large resources being poured into it.
That's today, but in 2 years' time, they probably can.
I don't think so. No.
So it's more than just GPUs. There's something else, is there, that's required?
Yeah, I think there's understanding how to structure those models. There are several phases involved in the training. So there's, first of all, selecting the right data to train on, and then the supervised fine-tuning, where you're basically training it how to answer questions, and then the reinforcement learning from human feedback, where you're basically spanking it when it gives you wrong answers or uses bad words or anything like that. All of these involve actually a lot of engineering experience, and some theoretical understanding is required to do this properly.
But isn't that knowledge spreading now? People are talking about how to do it, and moreover, people are finding ways to do it with less data. This is the interesting thing. People are saying, actually, we don't need so much data. We've got a cleverer way to learn from less data.
That could happen. It's not happening yet. But given that the systems are using about 1 million times more data than a human being needs, then I think there are likely to be developments that do change that. But those developments are not going to come from Russia and North Korea. They're very much at the gestational stage in the most advanced AI research groups in the West. If you're Russia and North Korea, you download a copy of Llama 2 for free through your proxies, so that Meta can claim complete ignorance about the fact that Russia is using their systems. And then you can have it generate disinformation or whatever. Another thing people are worried about is that these systems understand a lot about DNA synthesis, about virology, about pathogens, and they can advise people step by step on how to build a biological weapon. That's a very real concern that governments are actually investigating right now and working with the companies to figure out how to stop it.
So what are the ideas for practically stopping it? You propose things like a CERN for AI safety research. You've talked about more explicable or transparent deep learning systems with probabilistic programming languages. You've talked about ensuring that there can be a mandatory recall of AI systems if it's found that they've crossed some red lines. Are people listening to these ideas?
Yeah, people are listening politely. Whether they're going to come to pass. I did speak earlier today. GPI, which is the Global Partnership on AI, which is an organization originally set up by the G7, but now has a few dozen countries as members. So India is the chair this year. They had the summit happening today in Delhi. I spoke remotely to the Ministerial Council. I got the sense from some of the European delegates that they're a bit exhausted after the AI Act. It's like, oh no, we've got to do more regulations now. So the idea of these red lines is, if you think about a nuclear power station, the two basic kinds of accidents there can be a core meltdown, or there can be some other major release of radiation. Those are pretty clearly defined. Otherwise, you would say it's basically safe. But what does it mean for an AI system to be safe? That's a much more difficult line to draw. If it's giving helpful medical advice, is that safe? Or should we only allow that under the supervision of a human doctor, et cetera, et cetera? The line between safe and unsafe is very, very fuzzy. We don't know where it is, and it would be difficult to say, okay, you have to have AI systems that are safe. So the idea of a red line is something that's definitely in the unsafe part and reasonably clearly delineated and obviously unacceptable. So examples would be systems that replicate themselves without permission, systems that break into other computer systems, advising terrorists on building biological weapons, divulging classified information, defaming real individuals. These would all be pretty clear examples where if a system does that, it needs to be shut down and removed from the market. And what we do with nuclear power stations and medicines and so on is we put the onus on the developer to show us that your system is not going to cross the red line. And this is basically what I'm proposing. It's not the government's job to test medicines. It's the job of the developer to show the evidence that they have tested it and it's mathematically safe. That's what we need to do. Unfortunately, with the current type of systems that we're building, these large language models, we have no idea how they work. They probably pursue goals because they've absorbed goals from reading all of that human text, which is written by humans who have goals. But we don't know which goals they've absorbed, and we don't know when those goals might be activated, and so on. So it's going to be pretty much impossible to prove that these systems are safe, that they're not going to cross these red lines. That might be very inconvenient for the AI companies if we said, okay, show us that these systems are not going to do these obviously unacceptable things.
Well, not just inconvenient, it's just flat out impossible, isn't it? If and when OpenAI launches GPT-5, there is simply no way they're going to be able to demonstrate in advance that it's safe.
Okay, and should we just accept that?
That's a good question. You clearly think we shouldn't. There should be a moratorium. And I do think a purely rational species would say, what we're doing is astonishingly risky. Let's stop. And if it takes us 1,000,000 years to figure out how these things are to be made provably safe forever, then we'll take 1,000,000 years. However, we're not a totally rational species, and we're not going to wait. We are going to carry on. I have a lot of sympathy for the moratorium idea. I just personally don't think it's achievable.
It's not a moratorium. We don't think of the FDA as a moratorium on medicines. It just means that the developers of medicines have some work to do. We wouldn't accept a drug company saying, oh, it's a real pain to do this. It takes such a long time. So we should be able to just sell this medicine without any clinical trials. That's completely unacceptable. And that used to happen. There was an episode called the Jake Leg episode in 19th century America, where 400,000 people were paralyzed for life by an untested medicine. So if that's what you want, go ahead, except it could be a lot worse than that.
But you can't do with generative AI, and probably not with future types of AI, what you can do with medicines. With medicines, you can test them in silico, and then you can test them on animal models, and then you can test them on small numbers of humans, and then test them on large numbers of humans, which takes a decade or so, but you can do it, and you can avoid having the next thalidomide. You can't do that with generative AI.
Well, why not? They're even easier in some sense. They're still software. They're mathematical objects. We don't even have to deal with the complications of human biology. It might be that they have to develop wrappers that ensure that the system is behaving itself, or that we have to do the fundamental design of these systems a different way.
But as you say, we don't really understand how these things work. So how do we figure out whether this 100th test we've done is going to be replicated in the 101st example?
I don't think testing is an adequate way. Here's the thing. Medicines are not completely safe, but you can say, given that I've done this many tests on this many people, the chance that this medicine will kill the next person, assuming that people's biology is relatively similar, is less than 1% or less than 0.1%. And the benefit, with very high probability, the system will cure this disease. If you ask the same question, is it 99% likely to behave itself? They would say, well, we can't show that. Well, is it 50% likely to behave itself? Well, we can't show that. Is it 2% likely to behave itself? No, we can't even show that. So they actually can't show any quantitative probability of safety with these systems based on, I hired some clever people and they spent a week working on it and they couldn't get it to misbehave. In fact, what we've seen with pretty much every one of these systems, it's now well understood how to strip off all of the attempts that they have made to make them behave themselves. And they will do anything, all the things they're not supposed to do.
Yeah, you could jailbreak them.
They will answer questions about how to break into the White House security system. They'll answer questions about how to kill yourself, about how to kill somebody else, etc., etc. So at the moment, all their attempts at safety have been a complete failure. I'm probably not going to be very popular for saying that, but that's my understanding of the current state of the art.
So you're advocating a different architecture.
Yeah.
You're advocating, instead of continuing with large language models and tweaking it, memorably you said we should forget about making AI safe. We should think about making safe AI. So it's a different mindset, and maybe some of the same mathematics will still be involved, but it'll be structured in a way that we can, in a sense, look at it and convince ourselves that there's a high chance that this is going to be safe.
Yep.
But how much time is that going to take? Is that going to take 1,000,000 years, as Callum was suggesting? Is that going to take 2 years, 10 years? How do we get a handle on that?
It's hard to say. There's two basic ways. One would be we keep the same basic architecture, but we somehow try to wrap something around it that modulates the output or filters the output of the system and make sure that the wrong stuff doesn't come out. And this is sort of what Anthropic is trying to do with the Claude 2 model, where they have a second large language model that reads the output of the first one and then basically answers the question, does this output comply with the so-called constitution? And if the answer is no, then it doesn't reach the user. That's an interesting approach, but obviously it relies on the second model actually being pretty good at its job. And it relies on the fact that you're assuming the output of the first model is not going to jailbreak the second model. So the way you break this system is you figure out how to jailbreak the first one to produce an output that jailbreaks the second one.
Yeah.
So there we are. But I've not really followed this up, but I've heard that Llama 3, which is the next open source model to be coming out of Meta, actually incorporates a layer based on good old-fashioned symbolic logic to help enforce guarantees on what kinds of outputs it can produce.
Speaking of Llama 3,
I don't know anything more than I've just said.
I'm sure that you talked to Yann LeCun. I'm sure you know Yann LeCun quite well. He famously completely disagrees that superintelligence is A, imminent, and B, very, very risky. And there's quite a lot of people who just don't believe that superintelligence is a risk we should be worrying about. Famously, Andrew Ng said, worrying about superintelligence is a bit like worrying about overcrowding on Mars. What do you say to people like that who just don't buy the argument? And they say, prove to me that superintelligence is a risk. What's your elevator pitch to them?
Well, I just asked them a question. How do you propose to maintain power forever over entities more powerful than ourselves? And then they don't have an answer.
What does Yann say when you say that to him?
I've not asked Yann that question directly. Andrew Ng is slowly coming around. He's had a few conversations with Jeff Hinton, who's often described as the godfather of deep learning. And Jeff is very persuasive and very, very concerned. to the point where he's basically thinking he should tidy up his affairs because he doesn't think we have more than a few years left.
Why did it take Geoff Hinton so long to come around to the idea? To me, it seems fairly obvious. If we are creating entities which are going to be much smarter than ourselves, that's a risky thing for us to do. Why did it take him so long?
I can't answer that. We had a long conversation when he was visiting in London, soon after he resigned from Google. And I didn't ask him that. I imagine, like many people, he was working really hard on making AI systems more capable because they weren't very capable. And that was my state of mind until about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I guess, because I was on sabbatical in Paris from 2012 to 2014. And that gave me time to actually think about this in more depth. So it wasn't that I was unaware of the possibility. Even the first edition of the textbook from 95 has a section called What If We Do Succeed? And it talks about some of the predictions that people have made in the past, like I.J. Good and the intelligence explosion and so on. But I didn't really take the issue seriously in a real sense until about 10 years ago. And maybe Geoff was just too busy trying to get these systems to behave intelligently. And I think it was probably seeing what was going on with systems like Bard, Google's version of the large language model, and Palm and Lambda. So they had at least 3 large language models going while OpenAI was doing their GPT 1, 2, 3, 4. And what happened as we started scaling up these models, we also, more or less simultaneously over the last 10 years, developed algorithmic techniques that allowed us to do gradient descent on a vast scale. I tried back in 1986 to do deep learning, to build 7, 8, 9, 10 layer neural nets and try to get the learning signal to propagate all the way back through the neural net. And it was pretty much a complete failure.
Was that because there weren't GPEs around that were capable enough?
No, it was more, I guess, 2 things. One is that we didn't have stochastic gradient descent, or at least it wasn't obvious that that was an important component of the recipe. So stochastic gradient descent takes small random subsets of the data and passes them through the network, rather than trying to do the whole data set at once. The other problem is when you're using the standard neuron for a neural network, it has a sigmoid function, which is flat, and then it slowly goes up, and then it flattens out again. So it's sort of a slope that's smooth, but at the beginning and end, it's flat. And so if you're in the flat region of that function, you're not getting any gradient signal. And so what typically happens is that as you try to pass gradients through the network, they might start out quite big and you're changing the parameters quite a lot. But by the time you get back through a few layers, you're in the flat region of some neuron, and that basically zeroes out the gradient signal. It was traditionally viewed as extremely difficult or impossible to train networks with more than 3 or 4 layers. What happened was we developed stochastic gradient methods. We also developed, instead of sigmoid units, we developed something called the ReLU, which passes gradients through much more quickly. We developed something called the ResNet, which basically makes sure that you're never in the flat region. So there's a lot of these little techniques. They're sort of like when you're a cook, you learn how to make sure that your cake doesn't stick to the bottom of the pan. It's sort of that. It's not some giant intellectual breakthrough. It's like, oh yeah, greaseproof paper. We developed those at the same time that we were scaling these things up. GPUs also helped. And I think Geoff realized at some point that these capabilities, the ability to do backpropagation through a giant network, was actually something that was even superior to the architecture of the brain. That the brain can't propagate gradients in that way. And it probably has to use various kinds of elaborate, complicated tricks. Whereas we've been able to develop these methods that are incredibly effective at training very, very large networks. So he thinks it's just a matter of time. I actually don't agree. I agree with Jan LeCun that what we have so far is not enough to create general intelligence. And I agree with some of the things he thinks we still need to do. In fact, many of them are written in my book.
Human compatible.
They're written in the textbook as well.
So you think we need to make some more major breakthroughs before we're going to get anywhere near superintelligence?
Yeah, but I would say that having the large language models is a huge step forward that may make a lot of those other breakthroughs much easier. There are many groups right now who are trying to figure out how to bypass the various deficits that these systems have. For example, they only have this relatively short-term memory. So they remember what's in the context window, which is maybe the last few thousand words of the conversation, but they don't remember something that happened 3 weeks ago. They don't have a long-term memory in the same sense that humans do. And there are ways you can fix that. You can hook them up to a database. You can allow them to rerun all the conversations they had before. You can make committees out of multiple models where the job of some of the members of the committee is to remember things from 3 weeks ago.
Is that the mix of experts models?
Well, mixture of experts is an old term, actually, from long before we had language models. But yeah, I've heard people call them committees. And then there are ways of coupling them to more classical planning systems, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of groups who are basically trying to create AGI using large language models as components.
Yeah, well, we're an ingenious little species and we're working hard on creating our successor. Stuart, you've been very, very generous with your time. Perhaps I can tempt you to one last little morsel.
Yep.
What's your current guess? And it may be a completely impossible thing. What's your current guess as when we might get superintelligence?
I used to never answer that question. And then I did answer it once at a meeting that was supposed to be strictly off the record, Chatham House rules. And I said, within the lifetime of my children. And then that appeared within 20 minutes in the Daily Telegraph with the headline, Professor predicts sociopathic robots to take over the world within a generation.
Good old Telegraph.
I think my timeline has shortened from that, which was back in 2015. But my timeline's a little longer than a lot of my colleagues.
So if in 2015 it was in the lifetime of your kids, is it now in your lifetime?
I would say that, yeah.
Wow.
And what is the final message you would want to leave to our listeners that might balance or complement some of the other things we've discussed?
The obvious question that I mentioned earlier, how are you going to maintain power forever over entities more powerful than ourselves? It seems obvious that we have to answer that question before we create entities more powerful than ourselves. That's it.
And you've got some ideas on how to do it in your book and elsewhere.
Yes, I've proposed a way of thinking about this. So if you think about trying to make that question a little more tractable, you could say, what is a mathematically well-defined problem such that if an AI system solves it arbitrarily well, you're guaranteed to be happy with the result? And so what the book describes is a way of formulating a mathematical problem, which, at least in English, it's relatively easy to describe. The machine's only objective is to help bring about the futures that humans prefer. But it starts out not knowing what futures humans actually prefer.
It turns out, as we said earlier, we humans don't even know what futures we would prefer.
That's right.
So it makes this so interesting.
Yeah.
And so important. Let's have this discussion. Thanks so much for taking the time to put these thoughts on the table. We haven't solved the problem today, but we might be at least a few nanosteps closer to it.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. You have a remarkable ability to frame this discussion in terms that lay people will understand, even though you are actually at the cutting edge dealing with the nitty-gritty of the jargon-infested difficulties. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Callum. Thank you, David.
Thank you.